Industrialization didn't just build factories, it literally redrew the map of the entire world. In this explainer, we're going to trace that direct line from the steam engine to the global empires it created. We're going to uncover a chain of events that didn't just reshape continents, but continues to define the world we live in today. All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the powerful ideas, the rationales, that empires used to justify what they were doing. Then, we'll see how those ideas were put into practice through massive expansion. After that, we'll break down the global economic machine they built. And, this is so important, we'll explore how people fought back and how huge populations were forced to move across the globe. By the end of this, you won't just know the facts, you'll be able to analyze the complex cause and effect chain that built our modern world.
So, how in the world do you justify conquering an entire continent? Well, it wasn't just done with guns, it was done with ideas. Let's dig into the core arguments that imperial powers used to convince themselves and the world that they had the right to rule over others.
Let's be real, at its heart, the main driver was economic. The Second Industrial Revolution was an absolute beast, and it was always hungry. It needed insane amounts of raw materials. We're talking rubber from the Congo, cotton from Egypt, palm oil from West Africa, just to keep the factories running. And once those factories churned out all those finished goods, well, they needed new places to sell them. Empire was the perfect, if incredibly brutal solution to both of these problems.
But we want to make more money isn't a very inspiring slogan. So to justify all this, a really powerful and frankly dangerous new ideology came about: social Darwinism. Now, let's be crystal clear. This was not science. It was a twisted misapplication of Darwin's theories of evolution to human societies. It basically created a fake racial hierarchy, with white Europeans at the very top, arguing that it was just natural for them to dominate everyone else. This gave a sort of scientific-sounding excuse to what was really just conquests and exploitation.
And this quote right here from Rudyard Kipling's poem is the perfect example of the civilizing mission. This ideology said that imperialism wasn't really about profit. Oh no. It was a noble, difficult duty to bring things like Christianity, Western education, and civilization to what they called the backward peoples of the world. It was a very powerful, very paternalistic, and deeply racist justification. Okay, so with these justifications locked and loaded, how did these industrial countries actually go out and build their empires? Let's pivot now from the why to the how, and look at the methods of expansion, which were both technologically shocking and ruthlessly efficient. Just look at these two maps. On the left, you've got Africa in the late 1800s, a continent full of diverse, independent kingdoms and states. Now look at the map on the right, just a couple of decades later. It's almost unrecognizable, carved up by European powers. This was the infamous Scramble for Africa, a wild period of competition made possible by new tech like the steamship, which could travel up rivers, and the Maxim gun, which created a massive military imbalance. So how did they actually control these huge new territories? Well, you see two main approaches. On one hand, you've got direct state expansion. This is where governments themselves, using armies and diplomats, took over. We also see a big shift here, moving away from rule by private companies, like the famous Dutch East India Company, to direct rule from London or Paris. On the other hand, you have settler colonies. Think places like New Zealand or South Africa, where huge numbers of Europeans actually moved in to live permanently, pushing out the indigenous peoples and basically trying to recreate their own societies. Now, these empires weren't just about political power or flags on a map. They were massive economic systems, specifically designed to funnel wealth and resources back to the industrial centers in Europe. Let's break down how that engine worked. The system created what we now call export economies. Basically, colonies were totally transformed to become specialized suppliers for the colonizing country. I want you to imagine your entire region, which for centuries produced all sorts of different foods and goods for local people, is now forced to produce only cotton or only rubber. This completely shattered local economies and created this deep dependency that, in a lot of ways, is still around today. This table gives you a fantastic snapshot of what I'm talking about. Egypt's economy was totally re-engineered to grow cotton for Britain's textile mills. The Congo Basin was brutally exploited for rubber, which was needed for industrial belts and tires. West Africa for palm oil. And get this, even guano, which is basically bird droppings from Peru, became this super important fertilizer for farms in Europe. Each place was turned into a specialized cog in the giant industrial machine. But control didn't always require an invading army. A lot of times, economic imperialism was way more subtle. Instead of sending soldiers, a country like Britain might finance a railroad in Argentina. That investment gave them huge control over Argentina's trade without ever planting a flag. A more extreme example, of course, is the Opium Wars, where Britain literally used its military to force China into an economic relationship that was absolutely devastating for the Chinese.
Okay, this next part is so important. We absolutely cannot look at this history as a one-way street. The people being colonized were not just passive victims. They responded, they resisted, and they rebelled in all sorts of creative and powerful ways.
So was this expansion accepted passively? The answer is a huge, definitive no. Resistance was constant. It was everywhere. It took the form of everything from full-blown wars to spiritual movements, from organized political groups to simple, everyday acts of defiance. These responses weren't just reactions. They actively shaped how colonialism unfolded. A great early example is the rebellion led by Tupac Amaru II in Peru. He didn't just fight against the Spanish for economic reasons. He very deliberately drew on the powerful memory and identity of the once great Inca Empire to unite indigenous peoples. It's a perfect case of how resistance was so often rooted in pre-colonial history and culture. We can actually categorize these responses to help us understand them better. You have direct state-on-state warfare, like the long, bloody wars between the Asante Kingdom and the British. You have the rise of new nationalist movements, like the huge Sepoy Rebellion in India, which we'll get to in a sec. And you have these powerful rebellions driven by religion and spirituality, like the Mahdist War in Sudan, or the absolutely tragic Koza cattle-killing movement in southern Africa. Each one tells a unique story about the human response to being conquered. Okay, this is a perfect opportunity to practice a key historical thinking skill: comparison. I want you to pause right here and jot down a few notes comparing the core motivations of the Indian Mutiny and the Xhosa cattle-killing movement. Go ahead. All right, you back? The Indian Mutiny, or Sepoy Rebellion, was first and foremost a political and military uprising. It was started by trained soldiers, the Sepoys, reacting to British policies that disrespected their religions and took power away from their local leaders. Their goal was straightforward: kick the British out and take back control. The Xhosa cattle-killing movement was completely different. It was a spiritual and prophetic movement. Facing disease and losing their land, the Xhosa people followed a prophecy that said if they destroyed their own wealth, their cattle and crops, their ancestors would rise up and sweep the Europeans into the sea. So one was a fight for political power, the other was a spiritual act of desperation. Understanding that difference is huge. Imperialism didn't just move raw materials and armies around the world. It moved people. We're talking millions of people, on a scale that had never been seen before. The huge demand for labor, combined with the chaos of conquest, created a world on the move.
And this migration came in a few different flavors. On one side, you have coerced labor. Now, even though slavery was being abolished in most places, the need for cheap workers didn't go away. This led to systems like indentured servitude, where millions of Indian and Chinese laborers signed harsh contracts to work on plantations or build railroads. But at the same time, there was also massive voluntary migration, as millions of people, especially from Europe and Asia, chose to leave their homes to escape things like poverty and persecution, looking for a better life.
The effects of all this movement were profound. Back in the home societies, women often had to take on totally new roles as so many men left to find work. In their new countries, migrants created ethnic enclaves, think of Chinatowns or Little Italies, that were vital for preserving their culture, but also marked them as different. And this often led to a backlash. The receiving societies frequently reacted with racism and prejudice, which led to laws designed to stop immigration, like the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US. These dynamics created social tensions that, in many ways, are still with us.
All right, let's pull all these threads together. We've looked at the individual links in the chain. Now let's step back and look at the entire chain of causation that really defines this entire period.
Here it is, step by step. First, industrialization creates the need for resources and markets. Second, ideologies like social Darwinism pop up to justify going out and getting them. Third, states use their military and economic power to expand. Fourth, the people being colonized fight back in a variety of ways. Fifth, this whole process causes massive shifts in global migration. And the final result? A new, deeply interconnected, but also profoundly unequal global order is born. So why does any of this matter to you right now?
Well, just look at a map of the world. A lot of those unnaturally straight-line borders you see in Africa and the Middle East, they were drawn by Europeans in a conference room with zero regard for the people living there, and they are still sources of conflict today. Look at the global economy. Ever heard of the resource curse, where a country has tons of natural resources but its people are still poor? That's a direct echo of the export economies we just talked about. The patterns of wealth and poverty we see in the world today didn't just happen by accident. They were largely designed during this era.
Let's wrap up with one final challenge to get you thinking like a historian. To what extent was imperialism a greater force for economic change than for social change in the 19th century? I want you to pause and actually try to outline a response. You'd have to weigh the evidence, compare the creation of these new global economies against the creation of new racial hierarchies and the massive social disruption of migration. There isn't one simple right answer. The skill is in building your argument with solid evidence, and mastering that skill is what will get you a 5 on the exam.